Well, thank you for joining us today. So as we've already kind of discussed, COVID-19 has caused many employers to reconsider their on-site work requirements for many job functions. And employers and employees are really getting used to this hybrid environment or this remote environment. And often this offers some flexibility that opens new opportunities for folks. But I think a lot of people are excited to get back in the office, as we were describing earlier, and we've seen recent shifts given the Delta variant and sort of changes in the messaging, and we're very curious to hear how that's working for all of you. So whether you or your company or organization are planning to continue working fully remotely, going hybrid, or coming back in the office, it's certainly important to understand and address the topic of returning employees to a new work environment in the post-COVID-19 era. We do want to make a caveat that we are not HR experts, and we're certainly not infectious disease experts. We are communications experts, and we're focusing here on keeping people informed, engaged, and aligned. So AJC's change manager and communications consultant Robin Gervasoni is on with us today. Robin has recently worked with two very different clients in this very environment. So one that's large and one that's small. And she's found many similarities in how each employer is assessing and addressing the changes involved with having their employees return to site or work remotely. So Robin joins us today to discuss pros and cons of in-person work, tips on options, and also especially how to keep communicating and maintain alignment with your workforce. So thanks, Robin, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
To get started, could you tell us a little bit about the two companies you've been working with?
Sure. And everyone, if you have any questions, feel free to chime in. We have a small group. So, and also if you have experiences as well that you want to share, I'm sure everybody would love to hear it. So just recently, I was working with a large global pharmaceutical company, as well as a very small 500 employee manufacturing plant and company. And what was interesting is they were all grappling with how do we deal with this from a communication standpoint. And to be perfectly honest, this is new. Nobody ever predicted COVID happening. So many communication folks, they're learning how to deal with communicating a pandemic for the first time in their career. So what I noticed with these two employers is they just were like, what should we say? When should we say it? What should our approach be? And there was just a lot of questions coming up that were very similar. So what we found was the global pharmaceutical company, what they're doing is they're allowing their knowledge workers to come over time. It's a longer process. Where the manufacturing company, they actually had to have production occurring throughout COVID. So they had a lot of production workers going to work every day, and now they've recently added the rest of their workforce back on site.
Thanks, Robin. And you've also, I know, been at another employer recently in person. So maybe we'll just ask and turn to what are some benefits that employers and employees can expect from returning in person?
Yeah, actually, just yesterday, I was up at a company in Vancouver, and the excitement to be back in person with your colleagues and just to have that face-to-face interaction, it was very palpable. Like I even was surprised myself. It made me realize how much of a people person I was versus really enjoying the benefit of working remote. So that's one of the benefits. I would say it's also much easier to build trust and build stronger relationships when you're face to face. So typically in HR, if you have a team that is struggling to get along, the preference would be to have it face to face to help them build those relationships. In addition, a certain type of work. So if you have a project that requires a lot of collaboration, a solution would be working on site. Another thing is, one thing I would highly recommend you guys consider is new employees that were onboarded during COVID haven't even seen their desk yet or met their colleagues. So they're all eager to get out and see what this is about. They've met everybody remotely, but it's hard to tell what is that person really like and what will this company be like. And then I think that's pretty much it. There's many benefits, but that just gives you a snapshot of some of the things that we've been hearing.
Yeah. And of course, especially with Delta variant, people are maybe pushing back their dates to come back and experience some of those things in person. So, let's flip the coin. And what are maybe some drawbacks for working on site together in person?
Yeah, so I'm sure you guys aren't going to be shocked by these, but these were the typical ones that we've heard. We're hearing a lot of anxiety from employees. So if I come back to the workplace, how do I know I won't catch COVID from a sick colleague? And how do we know that we can trust that the right safety precautions have been put in place? We're also hearing a lot of, if my employer is not requiring my colleagues to get vaccinated, what if I'm sitting next to this person? Am I safe enough? So, but also there's also giving up that freedom and the flexibility. A lot of workers really did a great job flexing, and once they were told to work remote, they really enjoyed that, the flexibility, the freedom. And when you take that away, it can be considered a key takeaway. So it's kind of like they had this benefit of being able to work remote, and now you're telling them, guess what, you have to give that up and go back to work. And you're hearing more and more about this in the news, that especially a lot of technology companies are saying, I think LinkedIn even yesterday said, our employees don't need to come back to work. So if you're requiring your employees to come back to work, it could be viewed as a takeaway. And when you're in a market that's really competitive with talent, that's something to keep in mind. And then also, your family life has to adjust a little. So not only did you have to adjust to going and working remote, but now when you have to go back to working, you might have to add in time for transportation to get, wherever you have to commute to. You might have to think about childcare. Some folks just gave up childcare or daycare, and now they may have to sign their kids back up for that. So there is a lot of adjustment that has to happen to go back to the old way of working.
Yeah, thanks, Robin. There is quite a bit of adjustment, and Jim sort of preempted our next question on hybrid models. But before we go to that, and I promise I'll get to it, Jim, I do want to bring in the idea of communication. How would you even know if your employees are anxious about a return, and even know if they've got these concerns about childcare? How would an employer know, and how could they find out?
Yeah, that's a great question. So typically what we do whenever there's a large change, whether it's returning employees to work or whatever the change is, you really want to have a handle on what is the perception of your employees. So you can do it very casually. You could do a quick coffee chat, pull in maybe 20 folks and just have a conversation with them. What do you think about this? What's on your mind? What are you hearing from your colleagues? What are some rumors you're hearing? How do you feel about this? What concerns do you have? Or you can make it even more official. So the global pharmaceutical company we just worked with did a survey, all employee survey across the world to capture the information. So there's many ways you can do it, and those are just two examples. And we also recommend, what we're hearing is a lot of HR departments and communication teams are overwhelmed. They're dealing with COVID. They're dealing with, unfortunately, employees contracting COVID, and how do they alert everybody? And then also they're busy with recruiting and many other things. So we truly recommend considering a third party. Part of that, I was just recently with a large insurance company in Portland, and our employees, they just were not trustful of an HR survey. And they were concerned about, is it truly anonymous? Is it truly confidential, as you're telling us? And then also there was a concern, are you going to do anything with this information we provide you? So we really encourage the use of a third party because they can come in, they can keep it anonymous, and they also can actually quickly turn it into an action plan.
Yeah, we'll come back to that, but I want to jump to Jim's question on what is your sense for returning with hybrid models for employees? What does a hybrid model even look like?
So, and really, it's probably important to define what is a hybrid model. So that is truly just the ability for employees to work both on site and remotely. And you could have different degrees of balance, right? Or percentages. So it could be 10% working remote and 90% working on site, or vice versa, right? Or 25 and 75. Probably the most important thing is to evaluate what kind of work are your employees doing, and it's looking at all employees. So for example, is the work portable? Can you truly take that work home with you? Or is a high level of collaboration required? Those are some considerations. There are many other considerations, but those are definitely vital to think about. And then I think another thing is some roles it doesn't work to work remote. So if I'm a receptionist and I'm greeting customers as they come in our building, that may be a role that you can't do remotely, right? One thing I tell employers is don't go on the defensive. Working remote is just one benefit out of the entire total rewards package. Just as you offer dental or medical, it's just one of those things. And just with maternity leaves, right? Only a select audience can take advantage of maternity leaves. So same with the remote. But the most important thing is when you figure out the criteria of this hybrid model and what your approach will be, and you're listening to the employees, I would truly encourage you to put it through a legal team to just make sure that you've got all your bases covered. And also, if possible, put your communications through it as well.
Yeah. And I'm just checking in the chat. It looks like some other folks have joined us. I'm curious to know if you guys on the call are comfortable where people are right now, if they're working remotely, and where your company in general is at. So if you wouldn't mind typing in the chat if you're working remotely and if your company is allowing anybody on site, that would be of interest. So Robin, I'm wondering if you can, we kind of got through a few of the questions, what you should understand from your employees before deciding a path forward and how to get that via survey, or you mentioned these coffee chat concepts. And then you also talked about having a third party to provide some trust and also to make sure the results of whatever survey you do gets out there. Do you have any experience based on maybe the smaller company? I know you helped specifically with communications on this score. What did they tell their employees? What did they hear from their employees, and what channels did they use to get back to them?
Yeah, so what we found was it was really important to be really transparent and honest with the employees. The rumor mill starts up, right? And the most important thing is to get out there ahead of the rumor mill and with facts, like this is what we're going to be doing. What we did was we developed a really comprehensive communications plan, well thought out. And we thought of every audience. It's really important to do this when it's big news. And something like COVID or, a layoff or shifting a headquarters, big news like that, you never want to leave somebody out of the communications process. So what we typically do is we say, who would be the most impacted by the change? You really want to talk to those folks first and figure out what is that cascade. In addition, what you want to do is not leave anybody off the table. So you may have part-time employees that it's really easy to, like if you're running all hands, they may not be working on that day. Another group that is easy to forget are people that might be out on leave, for whatever reason, or people on vacation. So what we did was we had a lot of managers on standby that were going to reach out. They chose to call. I've worked with other companies where they would FedEx a package to somebody, even if they were on leave, to ensure that they got an official notification. There's nothing worse than hearing about a big change happening at your company, and you're hearing about it from a colleague rather than the official information. So I definitely suggest for a large communication such as this, having a well-prepared communications plan. And that also helps with the messaging. So one thing that I've noticed working with companies is you may have your top leadership teams totally aligned on messaging, but then as it filters down, that message changes a great bit. It's kind of that telephone game that you guys have all seen this in motion. So ensuring that everybody's aligned on the messaging is really important. So what we did, even though this was a small manufacturing company, we got the messaging, got it aligned, all the leaders were aligned on it, and then we pulled all the leadership team in, and that included supervisors and managers. And we said, we're about to do this. We gave them pre-notification. We're about to communicate this information to our employees. It could be challenging for some of them to hear this. Some of them are afraid to come back to work. This is what they're afraid of. And we said, we need your support. And the reason I'm calling this out specifically is managers are the most trusted resource from a communication standpoint. And if they don't hear from the manager, they're often going to go to their colleagues and say, what are you hearing? So you really want to have your managers teed up. And from experience with many companies, the managers are always like, don't just fling it over to us. Give us time to digest it ourselves and get our head around it. Let us learn what the talking points are and put them in our own language. Or also the managers give the news in context to what that team wants. So typically you'll have a leader of a company, maybe a CEO or head of HR, say, here's what we're about to do. But the people in accounting may say, well, what about us? What does that mean to us and our team? And that's kind of the role of the manager to help give that context. Does that help explain for you guys? I don't know if I'm going too fast.
I think that's very interesting. I see some people nodding, and I see these notes in the side. Thank you for those of you who've had a chance to respond. It sounds like there are people that are fully remote, except for things that need to be done on site, like manufacturing. It sounds like some people have been pushing back their returns. Eventually options to go to hybrid, depending on the role, needs of employees, and the global location. And then there's an interesting option there with one day a week dedicated to teams, maybe so that you get your collaboration with your team, but not everybody is there at the same time. I am curious to know how those options have been communicated in companies. Does anybody have a best practice they would be willing to share?
I could, Andrew, I could probably share maybe not, I won't say worst case, but I could give you a case that didn't work out so well for my former organization. And I think it's something, as we're looking forward from a communication standpoint to be very cognizant of. I think it touches a lot what you were saying, Robin, about getting the managers engaged. So our organization, we started sending out emails from our top level CEO saying, hey, we're going to start working on return to work. And here's all these wonderful things we're going to do. In the meantime, I was running an organization that kind of sounds like Rohit, across the country with 450 workers who were still working. They were essential manufacturing types of workers.
Yeah.
So they were seeing these emails from our CEO talking about coming back to work, and it became a huge dissatisfier for my team because they've been working the entire time. So it's a great example of not kind of connecting those dots from the CEO level down to the manager level. And so, of course, I gave the feedback back to them, like, can we stop on the return to work things, how tough it is to work from home while my team is actually working, on sales right now, concerned about getting COVID. So it was a really good example of how you can mismanage the communication. We got the feedback loop going after this. So now there's more reaching out to the leaders before we send those types of broadcasts out. And I think the other component that you mentioned, I think is a great demonstrated practice, is get it to the managers first, and then have the managers cascade that communication appropriately to their teams. Because I think that what's in it for me really comes out in that, like you said about the accounting department, it's hard to connect those dots when you see it coming from the CEO, but when you have it down to that organization, it's a lot more effective. So that's an example that I've lived through that I think somewhat appropriate to what you're talking about.
Yeah, I would say it's funny. It's sad that, all these little exceptions occur, but that's how you learn, right? Unfortunately. So what we typically do is when we have a big change, some questions are so basic that we ask are, who's not going to like this change?
Right.
Who's going to be challenged by this? Can you think of any exceptions where they might not be happy or they'll be really happy? So you really want to try to get at all the different types of audiences. The manufacturing company had the same thing, and luckily we caught that early enough. And what we did was we said, first off, we want to thank the folks that have been on site producing our product day in and day out through this COVID situation. And our business has increased, and you guys are really, the brand promise is coming alive thanks to all your hard work. Mm-hmm. Now let us address the folks that are going to be returning. But we also said, to the folks that were working throughout COVID, please be sensitive to these guys because they're coming back. They have an adjustment period as well because they've been remote. So yeah.
So kind of bringing up the awareness that people are in different positions. That is interesting. See some other chats in here. Anybody else would like to maybe share how your organization communicated your current status?
I'll say one thing, this is Rohit here, is like because we are in healthcare, for a clinical aspect, like people have to be like in office because of the nature of the work. But on the back end side, on the admin side, we have started with like 25% of like team being in office and different teams decide on different days. So as roughly say like Friday, nobody wants to come to office, which is fine. But other days, one team is coming on one day of the week. And that's why there's a camaraderie, there's collaboration that is happening. And of course, people have taken it differently. Some people like working from office and some people say, no, I have daycare issue, I have to spend time on commute and all. So it's a mixed feeling. But I will say personally, I've seen as if people work remotely, they are more productive. Like instead of spending like say 1 hour in commute and coming to office, they are available earlier. And so it's a mixed thing, but collaboration is also needed, that face-to-face interaction. And I think Robin mentioned earlier, anybody who has joined like after COVID has started, I have not met a lot of people. I've just seen them over like video conference and all. So it's always good to have that personal interaction, and that just makes work easier.
I would say one thing I would really, with this project, I would say be careful of the haves and have-nots. So what that means is you need to really be, whatever your approach is, be very thoughtful in explaining why this group gets to work remote or this % remote versus this group. And just have really solid criteria so you'll be able to explain it. The worst thing is to just come out and say, this is what the policy is without explaining the thought that went into it. And it's okay to have haves and have-nots, but it's just being able to clearly explain it.
Yeah. Rohit, did you feel like it sounded like you had the 25% option and people, some of them liked it, some of them didn't. You've seen productivity from workers that are remote, but you still haven't met some of your team members in person. As far as the communication of that option, was it just, here's what it's going to be, or how do you know how your company put that out there?
Like the communication was like, first it was decided by leadership, and then we started sharing it with like second level, third level leadership. And like it wasn't like enforced, and we still gave them an option that make sure you are vaccinated or you should like say get testing and all done. So just for safety of our clients and others. So it was, I think, as we said, like it was a sensitive conversation, and we are trying to be careful and giving it more as an option rather than enforcing it.
Thank you for sharing that. Margot, do you want to share? I'm curious to know as a manager how what your role has been in sharing with your employees.
Well, this is a really, really relevant experiences all across the board here in this room. We've had a couple of misses with some communication, right from the top, dropped in an all hands, and then not really, like you were saying, Robin, the explanation of what went into this decision. That's something that it's much easier for maybe certain people, but just it's a lot easier in person to say, oh wait, can we ask more about this, rather than unmuting yourself or turning on your video or whatever it is. It just seems like there's this kind of extra barrier there. So I like that advice, when decisions do come from the top, because they are sensitive, to make sure that in that sharing of information, right? Because somebody has to make the decision. So when leadership can do that, just explaining a little bit more about, okay, this is where we're coming from. And then, in our experience, it has been a lot of the management who's a little closer to the day-to-day workings of the teams, just having those a little bit more personal conversations, or, kind of understanding who works best in what situation, or who's likely to be the person who will hear the rumors, within the company, just kind of going to those people who are a little bit more up with their communication to make sure that, however the information is getting shared amongst the team, that it is coming back to management, and then that can be communicated effectively back to the leadership. So we have that feedback cycle, which on our team, we're pretty small. It's been a little ad hoc, but I am grateful to know that that's not just us, that it is a challenge, across the board. But yeah, it's been a lot better if we can have, leadership make the decision, and then immediate, kind of support from that management has been pretty critical, especially as we have these more challenging conversations about individual comfort level and vaccinations. Like, this is the health record information, so different people have different opinions there.
Yeah.
Thanks, Margot. Robin, I'm curious to know, hearing this concept of maybe waterfall down, and you mentioned that people often trust their managers the most. It's easier to hear it from your manager, whom you hopefully have met in person at some point in your career, than maybe the CEO, especially in a big organization. But our Margot brings up an interesting point, so I'll turn it back to you, which is, what is your recommendation on how to get the feedback back up? So if managers are talking to their individual contributors and they're getting feedback, Margot mentioned a feedback loop, how do you get that back up to re-influence and keep that cycle going on how to keep the communications rolling?
That's a great question. I would say, hopefully, if you're in a company and it's open communications, they have these loops already built in. But if not, I would definitely recommend talking to an HR rep, or also talking to a communications person. Communications is going to be very eager to hear what's going on, because they use that information to form the comms. But HR as well is another way to get it up. Or sometimes it's hierarchical. So you tell your manager tells their manager, and then it goes up. What's really important is the two-way communication loops, having that dialogue back and forth. And somebody once told me, think of your employee base as teenagers. Like, I've had two teenagers that were very challenging to me personally. And it was, why, Mom? Why do I have to do this? And it couldn't just be me saying, this is what you have to do and tough luck, just deal with it. It had to be this two-way going back and forth. And it's the same thing with your employees. So if your organization doesn't have those two-way loops built in, highly, highly recommend it. And you can even ask, like, HR, don't be shy. And you could say, hey, would you consider having a coffee chat? Some of the employees are struggling. Or even as a manager, I've had some pretty solid managers say, I just need to hear what's on the minds of my employees. And they said, could you help me? I helped them set up like their coffee chat for their department, and just take it. And sometimes the managers couldn't answer all the questions. They said, I'll talk to HR and I'll get back to you. But at least the two-way was happening.
Yeah. I think one thing you're touching on, Robin, that Margot, kind of ties a little bit what you were saying too. It's the idea of having your managers kind of cascade this down, I think has a lot of benefit to it. One of, I think, the challenges, you got to make sure your managers are prepared to be good communicators.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, that's, when you're cascading it down, I think there's you want to be very clear on the managers how they need to communicate and those things. I think organizations sometimes struggle. You're putting this on the managers, and you have different levels of communication now going throughout the organization. Some are probably very effective, some not so much, and not always clear what messaging is being distributed down. So that's an area that we need to look at as communicators, is how is it being cascaded down? How are the managers prepared and trained to give that type of communication.
Absolutely. Like what I've found with from a communication standpoint, even like a change management standpoint, a lot of people have been promoted for, good performance or years in position, but they haven't been trained on how to be a solid communicator or to handle change management. So it's something to keep your eyes on. If you have a really solid comms team, then it never hurts to say, do you have talking points? Like I just went to that meeting or I got the note from the CEO. Sometimes I would just use the note from the CEO and pull out some talking points myself and use them. But if you have a pretty solid comms team, they will have the talking points. I have to tell you, I worked at a company and I was never allowed to have an all hands meeting without having the talking points to hand to the managers. Sometimes we even gave it to the managers before we had the all hands meeting. But a lot of it is training them. Sometimes, you'll listen and you'll hear, wow, that manager is off message, and you have to rein them back in. And sometimes you have to say, you're not cascading. Like there's a hole here. Your employees aren't hearing it. Sometimes you'll see that when you do engagement surveys, you'll be able to evaluate where is that hole. And boy, we might have to go in and train some of those managers. So that was a great point. Thanks, Jim.
I'm curious to know if anybody on the line, maybe some of those who haven't had a chance to talk yet, if you're open to talking, have you received any of this training as a manager for how to communicate, kind of to Robin's point?
Yeah, I think, from our standpoint, I think the communication has been pretty robust. Of course, it's a big company and is typically pretty good at this, but there's a leadership team that manages the COVID messaging. All managers get a pre-communication before broader communication goes out that lists the message and then resources, FAQs, how to help, communicate the message, things like that. So I think from a pandemic kind of return to work, that's all been, as a manager, has felt pretty comfortable to me in terms of the support I'm getting. The question is really, what does return to work look like? And I don't think anybody knows the answer to that yet. From an engineering team standpoint, but I think that pre-communication before the communication has been really helpful.
Thank you for sharing that from the Intel standpoint. And that brings up another point. So what exactly does the return to work look like? I'll be honest, when we scheduled this, the Delta variant was not in full force, and most companies were planning a return to work. And the fact, the ones we've been working with were like the one Jim mentioned, planning for a September. So this variant has really caused us to rethink what we're doing with our clients and then them to rethink what they're doing. So that's kind of the next question I have for you, Robin, which is, if as a leadership team or a manager, you've communicated one thing, we're going to return to work in September, it's going to be optional, 1 day a week, the team is going to come in together, whatever it might look like, how do you mea culpa that if now you're changing your mind?
Yeah, so it's funny. A lot of folks are saying, I feel like I'm flip-flopping, right? Because one day you're wearing a mask and you need to be vaccinated. The next day you don't need a mask, all of that. So really, I think it's being really transparent and authentic. I mean, this is where authentic leadership comes in. As a leader, you could say, you know what, this was the information we had at that time. But as you guys know, COVID is ever evolving, right? And if all you have to do is watch the news, and you can see it changes day to day. But then just kind of reassure your employees, we're closely monitoring the situation. Your safety is our top priority. And we'll keep you guys updated as the requirements change. I really encourage folks to be in the loop with the legal requirements of their county or their state. What is the state doing, and try to stay in alignment, or, you can always do your own thing, but just be aware of what's going on. And just reconfirming that the employee's safety is a top priority. And then also I'd say thanking their employees for their flexibility. And you had mentioned one thing about it's hard to know what's going on in the beginning of COVID. We had to coach our employees, like, there's a lot of ambiguity. We're living in the gray. You know, we can't tell you black or white, this is what's going to happen. We can't tell you when you're going to return to work. But a lot of employees struggle with that. And we just had to teach them, we're just going to have to learn to deal with uncomfortable until we know more, because it's a little too early for us to make that call, or we might have to change the call, and we appreciate your flexibility. Does that make sense to you guys?
It does. Naomi Plomp here. What we also add from our side, and it also depends on the location, I have to be honest, is that we communicate that we are not planning to be, the first company who decides something. So definitely country or county rules are valid, but we might, even slow it down a bit more, as in mask is not mandatory in your state anymore. However, we decide that we want to, wait and see what's going to happen. So people know that they don't, immediately have to follow state regulations, that we're taking it slow, just indeed to keep employees safe.
That's a great point. I would also say one thing we noticed as well was, if an employee feels, say the company is not requiring a mask, if the employee feels not safe without a mask, by all means, they can feel free to wear a mask. And if they have like extenuating circumstances, say they have a very sick person at home, a relative or something, we encourage them to talk to HR. There could be a reason why they do not feel they can be productive at work, or they're petrified to go to work and catch COVID, for example. So I would say allow for that kind of flexibility with your employee base as well.
Thanks, Robin, and thanks for sharing that, Naomi. We've been talking about ideas and things that people are doing. Most of them are ideas that are working, it sounds like. I'm curious to know from you, Robin, and then of course from the whole room, what employers should be cautioned about missing, or if they fail to do something or fail to consider something, or something they have done that's just a big misstep. What are some gotchas that you've seen out there?
So it's funny because I thought through this and I completely forgot legal. I in this situation, because it's new to all of us, I highly recommend, before you communicate anything to your employees, try to have a legal team take a look at it. You just want to be careful with that. But I'd say one thing that's really important is compassion. So we all have been through this COVID thing and we're all tired, right? And just think about your employees. They were told, guess what? You have to go home and work. We don't care what your situation is at home. We don't care if you have an infant at home or toddler or whatever. And so just everybody's been through this roller coaster. So approaching it with compassion, of knowing that everybody's been through the ringer a little bit, would probably help. Obviously, transparency is key. And I think, trying to think what else. Being as well thought out as possible. Like, you don't want to look like, we're putting this approach together last minute. One thing also I'd recommend is it's not just on the employer's shoulders, right? We don't have to be defensive. This is a combination of the employer has to make sure they have the right safety precautions in place and the environment's going to be safe. But the employee also has to do things to make sure that they're not spreading COVID. So it's kind of a combination that we all have to help in this effort. So those are some of the things top of my head, but I'd love to hear what you guys have, what thoughts you might have on this.
Anybody have any gotchas or any examples of what not to do?
Well, I don't know if this is an example of not to do, because I think it's somewhat situational, but what our data said was that even pre-COVID, our office occupancy, in other words, the number of people who were in the office on any given day was around 50%. And so with return to work plans and employees indicating overwhelmingly that they prefer to work in some kind of a hybrid arrangement, that number was likely to decrease further. And so, what the company was looking at was, well, can we reconfigure the offices to take advantage of this fact, and provide, rather than having dedicated desks, because we don't have offices, right? It's an open workspace, but rather than having dedicated desks, just having people float to whatever desk they want to sit at or work wherever they want to sit, because we have lots of different kinds of working areas in the office buildings. And I think from a company standpoint, it was maybe we can, increase the office workspace, flexibility and also save some money. But then on the flip side, of course, you had employees saying, well, we're just getting through a pandemic. I don't think I want to come in and share a desk with somebody else, right? So that was, besides the other, complaints that people have about that kind of, shared workspace arrangement. So the company kind of floated this arrangement, got a lot of negative feedback, and so I think quickly turned on a dime and said, okay, well, we're not going to do that. And so I think, to me, it's an example, not so much the specific example, but since we don't really know what this environment's going to look like, the ability to say, well, that's obviously not going to work, we're going to try something else, I think is really important. And because we're going to have to learn as we go through this, and I think pretending we have all the answers up front is not the right way to go.
Yeah, it's like being agile as you're working through this. It makes total sense. I worked for a large insurance company, and we sold the idea of outsourcing some of our processes to India and China, that they're available should we lose electricity or the internet goes down. Well, then COVID hit and they weren't available. So they got hammered with COVID. So it kind of put like mud on our face, and we kind of had to do a little tap dance. So you never know what the change is going to be as a result of this whole pandemic. So you have to be ready to address whatever comes your way.
Well, it's been a great opportunity for everyone to show their humanity, I would say, and their generousness of spirit, and we're all in this together. Robin, the last couple of questions I want to put through before we'll give everybody the last few minutes for open Q&A. Who is the right person? You already talked about managers, you talked about CEOs. In general, who would you say should be communicating this if you had to say someone's responsible?
I think it depends on each company. What I tend to do is, who is the most trustworthy with the employees? That would be my recommendation. And typically it's the CEO or the head of HR, but is there somebody on a safety committee, for example, or somebody very knowledgeable in this area that should speak to it? But I'd say also, it doesn't mean that it's only one person speaking to this. We talked about the managers could play a role as well, and I always recommend, like, people need to hear about information multiple ways. So is it through a company newsletter? Is it going up on the intranet or a portal somewhere? There's other methods, and I highly encourage, yes, you may have one person speaking to it, but what are some other ways to get the message out? With the manufacturing plant, it was putting posters up in the break room, right? Because that's where they're hanging out. And we also did the bathrooms, for example, but like, what makes sense in your organization, and don't forget, people are remote. So how do you get to them remotely? So.
That is good. All right. And I think the last question I have is, we talked about communication and who's doing the communication and finding the trusted resources and considering all the channels. I'm mindful that when people see something come out once, if it's not reinforced, it's often like, oh yeah, they didn't really care about this, it's just lip service. So how do you recommend companies reinforce and continue the messaging? And honestly, beyond COVID, communicating in general, how do you recommend that whole channel keeps going?
So I think a communications plan is really important, because what you can do is list out what's your initial dissemination of the information, right? But then you can have other tactics in there, you know, in the next week, then we're going to do this, then we're going to do that. So kind of what I was mentioning, you could have somebody make the announcement, but then how do you reinforce it? Typically with large news, I'd highly recommend face-to-face, or it could be a webinar, but always allow that two-way communication. Always try to allow questions and answers, because you can think you know what's on their mind, but let them ask it, because then you get a better feel for, and you get to clarify what's on their mind. So another recommendation is FAQs. So if you do a survey or you do a coffee chat, or you're just hearing some common questions, you can even survey your managers and say, what kind of questions are you hearing? What concerns are you hearing? And then address it proactively in an FAQ that you can send out. Here's some questions we've been hearing from our employees. We wanted to address them for you. The worst thing you can do is not address some of these concerns or questions or even confusion. You want to kind of get the information out there as soon as possible. So.
All right. Thanks, Robin. I'm going to flip to your takeaway slide, but I'm also going to open it up and ask if there's any other specific questions about return to work. Again, we sort of flipped on this given the Delta variant and talking much more about communications than a lot of the hybrid options, but I'm curious to know if there's anything else you guys would like to discuss in our remaining time.
I'd love to just follow up on that first bullet point. I think transparency is the best policy, and it's always easier to work with folks at any level when they, you know, kind of agree with that and want to get to this place of transparency, and like that involves some respect and some honest communication, which, you know, all is well and good. Do you have any suggestions on how to make sure that you know, you can create that safe space so that coworkers, employees, folks at any level can feel that they can share that transparency and can give that, you know, that feedback? We've talked a lot about how to communicate these policy changes and this information, and can you just speak to kind of from that ground up feedback a little bit about how to make sure that as a manager or anybody else in the organization, you're really encouraging that and holding space for that, whatever that might need to look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say it totally starts with the manager. And, you know, it would be nice from a cultural standpoint to have HR and the leadership team model it, of course, right? But if that's not happening, I highly recommend managers say, I have an open door policy, and also let people start sharing their thoughts, and not I don't want to say punishing them, but let's have the conversation, let's bring it out. Typically with, and it's great we have Alex on the call, with lean and agile, when you have a stand-up meeting, anything can be discussed, right? So it's not a matter of what level are you and you're not allowed to bring something up. It kind of breaks down that whole hierarchy where anybody could have a great idea or a great thought. So that really I have witnessed in several companies where the communication lines just start happening naturally. And then typically some companies have they have like hotlines or email addresses where if anybody has a question, they can send it in. Another thing is in the employee engagement survey, which many companies run routinely every year, every couple of years, you'll be asked a lot of questions about how transparent is the organization? How comfortable do you feel sharing your opinion? And that's a great way to, you know, say, you know what, we really need to work on this. But I'd say from a manager perspective, in a meeting, in every meeting, saying, how are you guys feeling about this? Any thoughts on this? Employees want to feel like the change isn't happening to them, that they're being part of the change. So how do we make them feel that they are giving their input and they're being part of it and giving ideas? Is that kind of what you were after?
Yeah, that was incredibly helpful, Robin. And I think that was a good call out, specifically word agile as well. And just having that, just tacking on an extra question with stand up, right? That's that's a piece that's been tricky, being remote. We want to keep the meetings to a minimum and keep things being effective and let people work the way they want to work. And so our stand-ups are, what did you do yesterday? What are you planning today? Tell me your blockers, but encouraging that, from the management standpoint as, okay, hey, let's address, all hands last week, this came up, let's go around and share thoughts about this. We can keep it quick, but I think looping that into kind of that standard communication is a really good tip. So thank you for that.
And I'd also say in your one-on-ones. So like if you're having conversations with employees one-on-one, you can be asking some of those questions as well, to just get them to feel comfortable.
Thank you, guys. That was a great discussion, and thanks for the feedback, Margot. I'm seeing Naomi is writing not a question, but an observation from the employer side, understanding that people's personal situation will change over time. And that's a fair point, right? Robin, you mentioned earlier, people had to go home. Doesn't matter if you have a toddler or whatever it might be. Those things they change over time, and the needs of before may be different than the needs now. And so recognizing that just as COVID is evolving and there's changes, that people's personal situation is evolving, and be appreciative of that. And I think what you have here, Naomi, if you want to unmic, you're welcome to pipe in, but let's stay open and keep communicating. Thank you for sharing. Any other specific questions for Robin today? I can see you're typing, Jim. Do you want to unmute?
Sorry, I know you can see that, but I was just saying I need to run to my next meeting. Thank you guys so much for this presentation. It was a really nice discussion, great format, got some great takeaways. So thank you so much for pulling this together. Really appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you for that, Jim. And thanks to everybody for joining us. If there's no additional questions, I will email this takeaway slide so that you guys have that. And we certainly appreciate your attention today and joining us.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for all your ideas.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.